They called it the wall of cash. Inside JPMorgan's private bank, that was an elite category, clients so lucrative that normal scrutiny seemed to fall away. Jeffrey Epstein was one of those clients. For 15 years, the bank's corridors whispered about Epstein's wealth and connections. Officially, he was a mysterious financier. Unofficially, he was a rainmaker with friends in the highest places. In 2004, Epstein quietly helped broker a $15 million deal for JPMorgan, delivering them a stake in a coveted hedge fund. Executives celebrated the windfall, and Epstein's status rose. The head of JPMorgan's private banking began calling Epstein his most cherished friend. In return, Epstein funneled millions through the bank and brought more ultra-wealthy clients into JPMorgan's orbit. He was more than just a customer, he was an asset to the bank, in every sense of the word. But Epstein's wealth had a stench. Inside JPMorgan, some already knew it. As early as 2006, an internal report flagged Epstein's accounts. Compliance officers noted massive cash withdrawals. That same year, news broke in Florida. Epstein was under investigation, accused of luring underage girls to his mansion. Mary Erdoes, a rising executive who oversaw Epstein's accounts, forwarded a local news article about the charges to Jess Staley. "This is so painful to read," she wrote. Staley's response was swift, almost defensive. "I went and saw him last night. I've never seen him so shaken. He adamantly denies the ages." Staley stood by his prized client. He wasn't alone. In 2008, Epstein's secrets burst into public view. He pleaded guilty to soliciting a minor for prostitution. A registered sex offender now, and notorious and toxic, at least to anyone paying attention, many institutions cut ties. JPMorgan did not. Behind locked conference room doors, the bank's leadership weighed profit against propriety. He was tight with Les Wexner, the billionaire retail magnate who was another of the bank's biggest clients. Epstein had opened doors to hedge funds, CEOs, even former presidents. His value to JPMorgan wasn't just fees, it was access, so the bank's leadership kept him on. Years passed. Epstein's criminal status was known, yet JPMorgan's hierarchy remained curiously silent. Mary Erdoes would later admit under oath that between 2008 and 2011, she was alerted at least half a dozen times to Epstein's escalating legal troubles. Each time, it barely moved the needle. One email from 2011 shows Erdoes' terse reaction when told Epstein was officially classified as a high-risk sex offender, likely to reoffend. Her entire reply, "Oh boy." No follow-up, no action. Even when compliance officers flagged allegations of an investigation related to child trafficking. In 2010, the warnings were quietly filed away. At JPMorgan, Jeffrey Epstein remained untouchable, a VIP client with a protective shield around him. Not everyone at the bank could stomach it. By July 2011, JPMorgan's chief legal officer, Stephen Cutler, had seen enough. Epstein's name kept surfacing for all the wrong reasons. Cutler sent an urgent email to Jess Staley and Mary Erdoes. "This is not an honorable person in any way," the general counsel wrote. "He should not be a client." He pressed further the next day. "I would like to put it and him behind us. Not a person we should do business with, period." These words carry the weight of someone who understood the danger, not just reputational, but moral, legal. Yet, even then, the moneymakers won out. Staley and Erdoes were the bank's power players, and they decided to overrule their top lawyer. Epstein stayed. Why? In the shadows of the bank's towering headquarters, deals and loyalty often mattered more than right and wrong. Epstein's friendship with Jess Staley was profound, Staley's own word. 1,200 emails between them, many from Staley's JPMorgan address, paint a picture of extraordinary closeness. In one, Staley, lounging in a hot tub with wine, told Epstein, "I owe you much, and I deeply appreciate our friendship. I have few so profound." Another time, Staley boasted of giving Epstein a long, heartfelt hug. The correspondence took an even darker turn. Amid mundane discussions of business, they traded cryptic jokes seemingly in code. "That was fun," Staley wrote after one visit. "Say hi to Snow White." Epstein replied, "What character would you like next?" Staley answered, "Beauty and the Beast." Epstein quipped back, "Well, one side is available." Investigators would later scratch their heads at these Disney references, but given Epstein's known crimes, the implications were chilling. Snow White, Beauty, Beast. It sounded like a sinister shorthand for the young girls trapped in Epstein's orbit, and Staley was speaking the language. Even as Jess Staley left JPMorgan in 2013 for a new opportunity, Epstein's hold lingered. Staley's departure, in theory, gave the bank an opening to sever ties with Epstein at last. There was no one there to vouch for Mr. Epstein, Mary Erdoes later said. Indeed, 2013 was the year JP Morgan finally ended its business relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. Officially, the bank cited routine massive cash withdrawals as the reason for closing his accounts. Unofficially, the Epstein file was becoming too notorious to ignore. 15 years of banking for a now convicted predator had left a trail of questions and quietly panicking executives. Jamie Dimon, the CEO, insisted he barely knew Epstein's name during those years. In closed meetings and later legal depositions, Dimon said he never met the man, never worked with the man, and wished, in hindsight, JP Morgan had cut Epstein off sooner. Perhaps Dimon truly was distant from the dirty details, or perhaps deliberate ignorance was his defense. Because the dirty details were there, buried in emails, memos, and phone calls, some of them now pried loose by lawsuits and Senate investigators. They reveal a pattern of protection and approval that was anything but accidental. JP Morgan's own records show that Epstein was one of the bank's largest private clients, a fixture in an internal VIP list tellingly named the Wall of Cash. Top executives personally managed his relationship. Mary Erdoes, one of Dimon's inner circle, took meetings and calls from Epstein regularly, even after his conviction. Why would a prestigious bank's wealth management chief be in routine contact with a known sex offender? Because Epstein still had something they wanted: connections to money, to important people, a secret wealth network that JP Morgan hoped to capture. For Jeffrey Epstein, the bank was more of a vault. It was a conduit of power. Through JP Morgan's accounts, he moved money effortlessly to his allies and to his victims, millions to Ghislaine Maxwell, his confidant and procurer, including a one-time $19 million payment from an Epstein trust, funds to mysterious offshore companies like Southern Trust in the Virgin Islands, where Epstein engineered a personal tax haven with help from local officials. Epstein paid off lawyers, pilots, and who knows who else, all under the genteel cover of a private banking relationship. JP Morgan's officers saw pieces of this. They sometimes flagged them internally: the steady stream of young women entering Epstein's homes, the payouts classified as consulting fees or tuition, the wire transfers to Russian accounts and Eastern European models, signs of something awful beneath the wealth. But each time the alarm was sounded, it was silenced. The silence was no coincidence. Over the years, JP Morgan executives not only ignored their own compliance officers, at times they instructed Epstein on how to avoid detection. Internal correspondence suggests that a senior private banking official, John Duffy, advised Epstein on structuring his withdrawals to dodge federal reporting thresholds. Others in the bank deliberately kept compliance in the dark, omitting key details of Epstein's activity so that automated red flags might not catch on. It went beyond negligence. It started to look like coordination. Step by step, as Epstein's crimes continued, JP Morgan became his enabler, the institution that quietly greased the wheels for an international sex trafficking operation, all while collecting fees and referrals. Outside the bank, other powerful forces ran interference for Epstein. In Florida, back in 2008, federal prosecutors inexplicably cut him the deal of a lifetime, a secret non-prosecution agreement that immunized any potential co-conspirators from charges. At the time, the U.S. Attorney, Alexander Acosta, was asked why Epstein escaped serious federal punishment. Acosta's answer, whispered in confidence, was that he was told Epstein belonged to intelligence and to leave it alone. Belonged to intelligence. The words hang in the air, almost absurd, as if Epstein was some protected asset of spy agencies, off limits to normal prosecution. It sounded like an excuse from a guilty conscience, a fragment of a much larger secret. Either way, the result was the same. Epstein walked away with a slap on the wrist. His allies breathed easier. At JP Morgan, it was business as usual. Years later, when Epstein was arrested again in 2019, the house of cards began to sway. Epstein himself died mysteriously in jail, officially a suicide, though the circumstances have convinced few observers that the full truth came out. But his death set off a cascade of investigations into those who enabled him. JP Morgan suddenly found the spotlight turned on its own conduct. Lawsuits from Epstein's victims and from the government of the U.S. Virgin Islands accused the bank of facilitating and concealing Epstein's trafficking ring. Under oath, Mary Erdoes and others were forced to acknowledge what had been denied for so long. Erdoes conceded she knew of Epstein's crimes in general terms: convictions, lawsuits, the media allegations, but claimed she didn't think it was her job to act on any of it. "My responsibility is not to do something with every piece of news media that comes out about our clients," she said flatly in her deposition. A stunning admission. Even repeated reports of child abuse by a client did not move the needle. so long as someone else in the bank could be tasked to look at it. Jess Staley, for his part, denied in legal filings that he alone kept Epstein on, insisting that higher-ups like Jamie Dimon were aware all along. Dimon, hauled in for questioning, maintained his distance. He barely recalled Epstein at all, he said. The picture painted was of a giant institution where everyone and no one was responsible. A perfect machine for plausible deniability. But the emails and documents tell a different story, one of conscious choices. They show a bank that had eyes wide open to who Jeffrey Epstein was and what he was doing. One internal review conducted in 2019 after Epstein's final arrest pulled together a 22-page timeline of red flags the bank had ignored. Piece by piece, it became undeniable that JPMorgan officials knew far more, far earlier, than they ever admitted publicly. Under pressure from investigators, the bank finally did something that should have been done from the start. It filed reports to U.S. regulators about Epstein's activities. The numbers were staggering. In late 2019, JPMorgan reported 4,700 transactions linked to Epstein, totaling more than $1 billion, as potentially tied to human trafficking. Years worth of suspicious payments, all documented in hindsight, years too late. Why were these transactions only reported after Epstein was dead and the game was up? The answer is damning. For nearly 2 decades, while Epstein and his associates exploited underage girls, JPMorgan severely underreported his activity. Senate investigators later found that while Epstein was alive, the bank had flagged just a tiny fraction of his money movements, roughly $4 million worth. But once Epstein was gone, JPMorgan rushed to file reports on almost $1.3 billion dating back to 2003. The bank's own spokesperson tried to spin this, saying JPMorgan had alerted authorities as required, and that law enforcement simply failed to act. Internal evidence suggests that the bank filed many of those alerts only retroactively, once their long-standing complicity was at risk of exposure. It's the classic maneuver: cover your tracks, even if it means rewriting history on paper. Meanwhile, voices outside the bank, once muted, are growing louder. U.S. lawmakers are openly speaking of JPMorgan's conduct as something criminal. It's clear that JPMorgan Chase ought to face criminal investigation for the way it enabled Epstein's horrific crimes, Senator Ron Wyden announced in late 2025. His committee's analysis laid out how top executives tuned out compliance officers, withheld evidence of potential money laundering, and even coached Epstein on evading scrutiny. Wyden's investigators discovered that JPMorgan's senior people were deeply involved, reporting on Epstein directly to CEO Jamie Dimon, and they continued dealing with Epstein indirectly even after ostensibly cutting him off, because Epstein wielded influence over other billionaires the bank coveted. In one instance, emails suggest JPMorgan kept cozy with Epstein to stay close to Apollo Global's Leon Black, one of Epstein's closest friends and another multi-billion-dollar client. The tentacles of Epstein's influence were long, and JPMorgan clung to them. As these truths unfurl, the public's patience evaporates. Survivors of Epstein's abuse and ordinary citizens ask how a pillar of American finance could enable a predator for so long. There are calls for accountability and boycott. They point to the bank's pattern, how JPMorgan underreported Epstein-linked suspicious transactions for years, yet now readily deplatforms others when it finds inconvenient. They see a double standard, a bank that overlooked child trafficking because it was profitable, while swiftly debanking figures like a prominent Bitcoin entrepreneur or even a former U.S. president's family when it suits a political climate. The outrage is palpable. It's as if the moral inversion at JPMorgan has finally been laid bare. Protect the worst of the elite, but punish those who challenge the system. So we return to the core questions, the ones whispered since Epstein's first arrest and now spoken aloud. Was Jeffrey Epstein just a client to JPMorgan, or something worse, an asset around which an entire ecosystem was built? The evidence suggests asset, a person whose value to power brokers far exceeded the balances on his statements. Epstein moved in a rarefied world of intelligence officials, royalty, tech moguls, and Wall Street barons. He collected secrets and perhaps traded them. His address book read like a who's who of global influence. A man like that is useful to banks, to governments, to anyone who thrives in the gray areas of money and power. JPMorgan bankers once mused that Epstein was well connected globally, and they did not want to lose this client. They didn't lose him until it became absolutely untenable to keep him. Why did that relationship continue after his crimes were known? Because too many benefited from it. Who benefited? The bank, first of all. JPMorgan earned millions managing Epstein's assets and likely tens of millions more from the rich clients he brought through their doors. Executives like Jess Staley rode Epstein's patronage To personal success, Staley ascended the ranks and lauded a plum job as CEO of Barclays, a trajectory that might have been very different had he not delivered hedge funds and billionaires courted through Epstein. Powerful individuals in Epstein's orbit benefited as well. They gained financing, introductions, or a slice of Epstein's dubious ventures. Les Wexner benefited until he discovered Epstein stole from him. Leon Black benefited until Epstein's shadow swallowed his reputation. For a time, even the U.S. Virgin Islands local government benefited. Epstein showered donations and investments in exchange for lax oversight and a paradise base of operations. So many hands were greased by Epstein's continued freedom. Who protected him? The pattern of protection sprawls from private meetings in Manhattan boardrooms to government offices. Inside JPMorgan, protection came in the form of deliberate blindness. Mary Erdoes insisting it wasn't her role to question a high-profile client, Jess Staley personally intervening to keep Epstein's accounts alive, compliance personnel being ignored or overridden. Protection came from the bank's upper echelons, who were more concerned with fees and deals than the source of Epstein's money or the cries of his victims. Beyond the bank, protection came from prosecutors who cut inexplicable deals, from federal attorneys who sealed evidence and granted immunity to unnamed accomplices, from politicians who accepted Epstein's donation and flew on his jets while pretending nothing was wrong. It came from enablers like Ghislaine Maxwell, who managed Epstein's dark affairs while mingling with the global elite. And if the whispers about belonging to intelligence hold any truth, protection may have come from factions within governments who saw Epstein as a useful tool to entrap, to blackmail, to gather secrets, and ensured he was shielded when needed. The result was a coordinated wall of silence around Epstein's actions, with JPMorgan as one of its cornerstone pillars. Who lied and why? In the aftermath, nearly everyone in a position of authority lied, if not outright then by omission. JPMorgan lied by saying for years that it had no indication of wrongdoing, even as its files bulged with internal warnings. Jess Staley lied by downplaying his intimacy with Epstein, portraying it as professional when the emails show it was anything but. Mary Erdoes, in deposition, clung to phrases like, "I don't recall," over 100 times, distancing herself from decisions clearly made under her watch. Jamie Dimon, the public face of the bank, claimed ignorance that strains belief. Could the chief executive truly be oblivious that one of his biggest clients was an accused trafficker making headlines? Could the chief executive truly be oblivious that one of his biggest clients was an accused trafficker making headlines? These lies were told for a simple reason: self-preservation. The truth was too incriminating. Admitting what really happened, that profit was placed above basic humanity, would destroy careers and reputations. So the lie was repeated. We didn't know. But they did know, they just thought they'd never be exposed. And so, piece by piece, the pattern emerges, is a pattern we've seen before in other scandals and cover-ups. A powerful institution confronted with a choice between conscience and convenience chose convenience. Over and over. When warnings surfaced, they were rationalized away. When crimes were revealed, they were minimized as allegations. Money was flowing, and that was enough to suspend questions. This pattern matches the blueprint of every organized abuse of power. First, deny the wrongdoing, then, when it cannot be denied, deny responsibility. JPMorgan followed that script to the letter. In doing so, the bank became not a bystander, but a participant, perhaps not in the abuse directly, but in the machinery that allowed it to happen and to persist. If a global institution continued business with a known trafficker for years, was that incompetence, convenience, or participation? The facts speak for themselves. This was no mere incompetence, not the kind that can be chalked up to a few bad apples or oversight slip-ups. There were far too many red flags seen by far too many people. It's said that hindsight is 20/20, but in this case, foresight was clear too, and it was willfully ignored. Convenience? Absolutely. It was convenient for JPMorgan to pretend Jeffrey Epstein was a legitimate client. It was convenient to enjoy the profits and the prestige of his connections. It was convenient to look away from the ugly source of his money. Eventually, convenience becomes complicity. When warnings are ignored year after year, when internal voices say stop and the institution answers go, that is participation in all but name. JPMorgan executives, through their inaction and obfuscation, participated in enabling a monstrous abuse scheme. In the end, as we sift through emails and memos and sworn testimonies, a chilling realization settles. This was not a mistake. It was a series of choices, calculated, deliberate choices to turn a blind eye, to aid a profitable client, to preserve an alliance with power at the expense of the powerless. A bank like JPMorgan does not shelter a figure like Epstein by accident. Behind every waved alarm was a decision maker, weighing risk and reward, and choosing to protect the bank's revenue over the lives of girls Epstein was destroying. Jeffrey Epstein is gone now. JPMorgan has paid settlements and issued apologies, and those in its halls would like the world to move on. But the door is slowly closing behind all of us, locking us in with the truth of what happened. We are left to face that truth in the quiet, ominous silence that follows such revelations. That silence asks, if one of the world's biggest banks could be drawn into the orbit of a pedophile trafficker and spend years quietly abetting him, what does that say about our systems of accountability? It asks those who else received the Epstein treatment behind closed doors. It asks how many warnings we have to ignore before convenience becomes conspiracy. And finally it asks, in a whisper that feels like a shiver down the spine, when an institution as powerful as JPMorgan Chase aids and abets evil under the guise of business as usual, was it incompetence? Was it simply convenient? Or was it something far darker? A willing partnership in one of the most heinous enterprises of our time. The answer, unsettling as it is, has been there all along, written in the bank's own emails and actions, waiting for us to finally read it.